Imagine you are sitting in a room and your only task is to speak about everything, to say everything without a filter, without focusing on any specific topic, and zero concentration. It is just relaxing and talking. This is called free association in psychoanalysis. But if you actually sit down and try to do it, to generally speak without any forward planning or conscious filtering, you realize very quickly that it's hard to just open the mouth and say absolute everything. It goes against almost every single instinct we have. Because as social human beings, communicating with one another, we naturally think before we speak. It's because from the moment we learn to speak, we are taught to organize our thoughts. We are taught to carefully put our sentences together, constantly paying attention to what is happening around us. We notice the environment, we consider the audience, we evaluate the context, and then we build a narrative that serves our immediate, social, or even survival needs. So to suddenly be told to stop doing all of that, to stop carefully choosing our words, or simply say whatever comes to mind, can feel surprisingly difficult. And most people discover very quickly that it is much harder than it sounds. For the conscious mind, speaking freely can feel like giving up a level of control that it has spent a lifetime maintaining. We are used to organizing our thoughts, checking our words, and deciding what is appropriate to say before we say it. But free association asks us to set the process aside, and the result is that the mind often resists. Thoughts are held back, certain topics are avoided, and moments of hesitation appear rather than allowing ideas to flow freely. The conscious mind keeps trying to guide, organize, and censor what is being said. But the fundamental rule of psychoanalysis requires the patient to speak their thoughts without any reservation whatsoever, and crucially to make absolutely no attempt to concentrate while doing so. And asking someone to speak without concentrating on anything sounds almost impossible, since the moment we open our mouth to speak, the brain has to find words, select nouns and verbs, putting them in right order, and construct meaningful sentences. So isn't free association just an illusion? Not quite. The concentration Freud asks patients to suspend was not the basic mental effort required to speak. He was not asking people to stop thinking altogether, which would be impossible. Rather, he was targeting a different kind of concentration, the constant monitoring, judging, and editing performed by the ego. Since the ego acts like an internal editor, continually editing thoughts before they reach consciousness or are spoken out loud. So, free association does not eliminate the mind's ability to form language. Rather, it asks the patient to relax this internal editor as much as possible and allow thoughts to emerge without immediately judging, organizing, or censoring them. The reason to speak everything without filter is because free association relies entirely on the assumption that all lines of thought, no matter how fragmented or bizarre they seem on the surface, tend to lead to what is significant. So every thought matters, every single one. According to Freud, nothing comes from nowhere. If a patient suddenly starts talking about a specific shade of a yellow raincoat they saw 3 weeks ago, that thought was not generated randomly. It appeared for a reason. Something brought it into consciousness at that particular moment. It was pushed to the consciousness by an underlying, often unconscious pressure. So the idea is that the mind is fundamentally incapable of producing meaningless material. There is no junk data being brought to the conscious mind. Every association points somewhere. Now, if every thought has an unconscious source, an important question remains. What guarantees that the chain of association will actually lead us towards the central conflict rather than going from one topic to another. Freud's answer was that the unconscious itself provides the direction. The patient may believe they are drifting without any aim, but beneath the surface, thoughts are linked through emotional connections that are often invisible to conscious awareness. As one idea leads to another, recurring themes, memories, wishes, fears, and conflicts begin to reveal themselves. In other words, free association works because the path may seem chaotic, but Freud believed there is an underlying logic to it. Since Freud believed that people are not simply talking at random, the mind moves toward what is unresolved because at some level there is a wish to find relief from a suffering. They usually make people start analysis since they are suffering in some way. They may be struggling with a conflict or symptom or an anxiety or recurring pattern they cannot fully understand. So during free association, when the usual filtering and editing processes are relaxed, the chain of associations tends to gravitate towards the material carrying the greatest emotional charge. Thoughts, memories, and feelings begin to circle around the underlying conflict. Freud believed that the mind is constantly trying to reduce internal tension. As a result, free association can gradually lead towards the very material responsible for the tension. But Freud immediately adds an important qualification. This movement towards insight is not automatic. The associations may be drawn towards what matters most, but there is another force operating at the same time: resistance. And resistance is one of the central concepts in psychoanalysis. The closer a patient gets to a painful memory, an uncomfortable truth, or a threatening wish, the more likely resistance is to appear. They may change the subject, forget something important, arrive late for sessions, dismiss a thought as irrelevant, or suddenly find free association difficult. In other words, the mind is pulled into two directions at once. One moves toward uncovering the conflict, while another works to keep it hidden. The entire process of psychoanalysis unfolds within this tension between uncovering and resistance. And to bypass these defenses, patients must relax to drain the mental energy that resistance need to keep working. By demanding relaxation and telling the patient not to concentrate, the analyst tries to disarm the patient's ego. So if building walls of resistance is our default survival state, why not just bypass the conscious mind entirely? Why force patients to endure all of this? This brings up a critical historical moment in psychoanalysis, which is Freud's abandonment of hypnosis. Hypnosis essentially bypasses this entire mechanical problem. It puts the conscious mind to sleep. It temporarily dissolves the resistance and allows the patient to speak directly to the unconscious. It seems much more efficient. Freud initially relied heavily on hypnosis, precisely for these reasons mentioned. It felt like a shortcut to the buried trauma, but the clinical reality proved to be much more complex. Because under hypnosis, a person might remember buried memory, but the structure of their mind stays the same. The defenses that hid the memory are still there, just temporarily ignored. The moment the patient wakes up, the defenses return. With free association technique, the patient is fully awake, not hypnotized, and the analyst can see resistance showing up during sessions, such as when a patient fails to freely associate. But resistance is not an annoying block. It is the actual data the analysts need. By keeping the patient awake, conscious, and asking them to free associate, the analyst watches the defense mechanism working in real time. For example, a patient might talk smoothly without any problem about their morning routine, or about a bird they saw the other day, or about a childhood memory, but then suddenly stop. They might stutter, laugh, call their thoughts stupid, or change the subject to the weather. The moment they judge a thought, they are concentrating and acting as an editor. The relaxation has failed. This failure reveals how the mind's defenses are built. The analyst sees exactly where hidden defense has blocked the patient's thoughts. Now, the goal of psychoanalysis isn't just to extract the hidden painful memory. It is to map the defenses that are keeping it hidden, to map these defenses by bumping to them. In other words, free association forces the patient to bump into their own internal walls while the analyst observes the collision, and this completely reframes what a successful session looks like. Because a patient failing to speak, a patient hitting a massive mental block and sitting in silence, isn't a failure of therapy. It is the therapy working. The wall, the mental block revealing itself is the progress. Now we have the patient on the couch. They are trying to relax. They hit a wall of resistance. Their associations dry up and they fall silent or change the subject. And then what? The popular view is that the analyst is a silent, passive observer who simply sits back and lets the patient talk until an answer eventually appears. According to this view, the analyst's role is largely to remain quiet while the patient does all the work. But this is an oversimplification. It creates the impression that psychoanalysis is a process that unfolds almost automatically, as though insight will emerge on its own if the patient simply keeps talking long enough. According to this popular view, if the patient free associates long enough, the hidden conflict, memory, or wish at the center of the suffering will eventually appear by itself. The patient's thoughts move from one topic to another, one memory to another, one image to another, until a crucial piece of information finally emerges. In this picture, the analyst has very little to do. The task is to simply sit, listen, allow the patient's association to unfold naturally. This view makes analysis seem very simple. The patient talks, the unconscious reveals itself, and the truth gradually comes to light. But rather than being a pure isolated monologue, psychoanalysis becomes a highly interactive process in which both participants influence what unfolds, because when the analyst makes an interpretation, the patient's next thoughts are no longer completely free in the original sense. They become, at least in part, reactions to the analyst's intervention, and that changes everything. Imagine a patient has been speaking freely from one memory to another, following their own chain of associations. Then the analyst says something. At that moment, something shifts. The analyst's words change the entire situation. Up until then, the patient's thoughts were being guided primarily by their own internal association. Now, an external element has entered the process, and the patient feels they must respond to it. And that response can take many forms. The patient may feel understood and experience a powerful emotional reaction. They may feel exposed and become defensive. They may eagerly agree with their interpretation because it feels insightful. They may reject it because it feels threatening. They may become angry, embarrassed, relieved, suspicious, and grateful or confused. And this is where psychoanalysis becomes especially interesting because it creates a new psychological event that the patient must deal with. The patient's reactions to the interpretation becomes as important as the interpretation itself. So this means that the image of a perfectly free association session is largely an idealization. There may be moments when the patient is simply following their own chain of thoughts, but they may hit a wall of resistance. and their associations dry up, and they fall silent or change the subject. And the moment the analyst intervenes, a new dynamic emerges. The patient's thoughts are now influenced not only by their own unconscious associations or resistance, but also by their relationship with the analyst. This is where concepts such as transference becomes crucial. The patient is not reacting to a neutral statement. They are reacting to a statement delivered by a person who has gradually become psychologically significant. The analyst may unconsciously come to represent a parent, an authority figure, a critic, a supporter, or someone else from the patient's past. As a result, every intervention has consequences because the patient is no longer responding only to their own thoughts. They are responding to the analyst, to what the analyst might think of them, to what the interpretation means, and to the feelings that the interpretation evokes. This process becomes a constant movement between two states. At one moment, the patient is immersed in their own associations, allowing thoughts to emerge freely. At the next moment, they are reacting to the analyst's interpretation and to the emotions that the interpretation has stirred up. Psychoanalysis therefore operates through a continuous back and forth movement. The patient follows their associations, hits a wall of resistance, the analyst intervenes, the patient reacts, new associations emerge, another resistance appears, the analyst intervenes again, and the cycle continues. So when we put all the pieces together, psychoanalysis is not about simply uncovering a hidden memory and removing it. The underlying conflict is gradually approached through free association, blocked by resistance, highlighted by the analyst's interpretations, and then worked through by the patient's ongoing movement between experiencing and reflecting. The patient follows their thoughts, encounters their defenses, reacts to interpretations, and learns to observe their own mind from new perspective. Through this process, unconscious conflicts become increasingly visible and less powerful.